I've occasionally said to classes that if I had to single out any event as evidence of some civilization in a distant galaxy beyond the Milky Way, taking pity on us for the slow progress of the human imagination in dealing with its problems, the evidence might well be the life of Aristotle and his accomplishments. It's almost as if such a distant galactic neighbor might have said, "For goodness sake, those human beings don't seem to be getting on with it at all. Aristotle, why don't you go down there and get things going?" There is so much in Aristotle that is original that inevitably much would have to be subject to criticism in subsequent centuries. But the sheer intellectual power of this man, expressing itself in biology, natural science, ethics, politics, metaphysics, logic, is simply without parallel in the history of thought. There is almost no academic or scholarly subject commonly taught that does not bear the stamp of his influence, sometimes so utterly and durably that we had to get rid of the stamp in order to see further or more clearly, and perhaps progress beyond the point where Aristotle had left the subject. No single lecture, then, or even a full course of lectures, can do justice to the breadth and depth of his accomplishments. But maybe a sketch will encourage further inquiries into the fuller picture. Aristotle is the son of a physician. In biology, we might guess he had a particularly strong grounding, but surely in a far wider range of subjects. Though not an Athenian, he enters as a student in Plato's academy, where he remains for nearly 20 years. And this assuredly is not because he was a slow learner. He stays within the Platonic circle, where he surely would have been expected to compose dialogues early on, and there is evidence that his earliest writings were in the dialogue form. All of the students in the academy had to do that. Those writings, however, have not been found. In fact, such accounts as we can put together of what he did write, or at least notes taken on his lectures, of the treatises that he actually is responsible for, indicate that we have only a small fraction of the total output of this fertile, searching intelligence. Accordingly, one answer to the question, what is Aristotle's position on X or Y or Z, must be qualified to acknowledge that his firmest or final position might appear in works that we may never find. Now, I should begin with a few words about the treatise of Aristotle's which came to be called his Metaphysics. It is one of the greatest works in the history of philosophy. It has a feature, actually, that is sometimes overlooked. It's also the first treatise that serves as a critical history of philosophy. And it reflects a quite regular part of Aristotle's method. You begin a work by noting what others have had to say on the same subject. Note what was either unexamined or poorly executed by earlier writers. And then you begin to develop your own argument. This is a standard approach in Aristotle. In the Metaphysics especially, he sets down the teachings of a wide range of Socratic and pre-Socratic teachers. He tries to give a fair hearing to views we come to know are radically different from his own, and in this he is generally successful. He obviously has his own program and agenda, and this does color some of his presentations of competing views. Still, the Metaphysics remains the earliest systematic presentation of the ideas that were dominant in the several schools of pre-Socratic and Hellenic thought in general. But the work begins on a new and different note, and I quoted part of this opening passage in a previous lecture. How does the Metaphysics begin, this utterly deep and penetrating inquiry? It begins this way. All men by nature desire to know. An example of this is the delight we take in our senses. For even apart from their usefulness, they are loved for their own sake, and none more than the sense of sight. Here is the commencement of the Metaphysics. All men by nature desire to know, so he already accepts that there is an inexplicable impulse within us to acquire knowledge of the world. And then, in a nearly offhand way, he says straight out that the evidence for this universal inclination is what? The delight we take in our senses. So here at the outset we discover that this long-term student of Plato's is not to offer a philosophy that depreciates the senses. Aristotle is too much the biologist, too much the natural scientist, too much the man with both feet on the ground to be dismissive of the information gleaned by the senses. Not only that, but famously, Aristotle will argue that nature produces nothing without a purpose for it, that chance is not the operative principle in the universe, and that things are to be understood in terms of the purposes and ends they serve. Nature certainly would not have fitted out animals with sensory organs for the sole purpose of deceiving the entire animal kingdom. And indeed, if that had been the design of nature, the senses as paths to deception, creatures would not have got from one side of the road to the other. So we already see in the very opening of the Metaphysics something of a common sense, naturalistic perspective in a work that is otherwise probably the most subtle of all of Aristotle's philosophical writings. As an opening statement, the first sentence of the Metaphysics, the opening sentences, are a veritable vindication of knowledge gleaned by perception. That this is incomplete, there is no doubt. But if we engage the problem of knowledge with any hope of success, perception must be the starting point. The starting point for our journey toward the truth is a sensory awareness of the world around us. In fact, in other works, Aristotle will define the very essence of animal as such as, quote, that which has sensation. The very power that establishes an entity as an animal is the capacity for sensation. In his naturalistic works on the parts of and the history of animals, Aristotle assigns to perception many powers and functions that we would be inclined to subsume under such headings as intelligence or cognition. And in doing so, he grants to the animal kingdom rich perceptual powers that go well beyond elementary sensory functions. But he will then deny the animal kingdom that culminating and defining rational power that he regards as reserved to the human psyche alone. Now, this is less Aristotle depreciating the animal kingdom as elevating the role of perception in the affairs of life and in adaptation to the demands of the environment. Animals are not depreciated for want of rationality because their perceptual resources include much that we would take to be rich cognitive power and ability. Now, because there's something joyous about perceptual experience itself and the knowledge thereby gained, Aristotle dilates on perceptual modes of knowledge. This all becomes possible because we're constituted biologically in such a way as to be able to pick up information from the external world. That's what the sense organs are all about. And this leads us to Aristotle's understanding of the various powers that the animal kingdom comes equipped with, and a scheme of classification that will distinguish between and among animal types in terms of these powers or faculties. Now, power or faculty in the Greek is dunamis. We get the word dynamic from this. For example, the power to walk would be the dunamis for walking. And the English word dynamic is etymologically arising from that Greek word and all variations of dynamic, dynamism, etc. Now, if we're to have self-knowledge, or knowledge of other forms of life, we must have some basis on which to assign various forms of life to proper categories. Just where do human beings fit in the great scheme of things? What's so different about us versus rabbits? Aristotle begins with the kind of question a scientist would ask when seeking a reasonable basis upon which to divide the living from the inanimate realms. What's the fundamental power in virtue of which a living thing has life? There's the core question. How do you know you're in the realm of the living to begin with? What has to be there? That is, what is it that the soul, as it were, the psyche of an entity must possess by way of, as it were, animation, such that life itself becomes possible. What dunamis must the soul have? Now, at the most fundamental level, there must be a nutritive power. That's basic. There must be some means by which the creature can absorb nutritional elements from the environment and through that activity grow and survive. All living things have this, which is essential for the survival of the individual creature. Now, what about the survival of a whole class of creatures? For this, there must be a reproductive power, some means by which a given organism is capable of duplicating or bringing its kind about. So again, at the most fundamental level of psychic power, or psychic dunames, the nutritive and reproductive functions are the essential properties of all living things. Added to this, where living systems are more complex, and this includes plants, of course, where living systems are more complex, there is also a locomotive power. The entity is now capable of some degree of movement. Aristotle notes that there are plants that do this. Venus's flytrap, of course, is a common example. They'll close over an insect caught in the sticky substance of the Venus's flytrap. So as we examine ever more complex specimens, we discover powers added to those of nutrition and reproduction. Here now we find locomotion, yet another dunamis. But inclusion in the animal kingdom requires something else, namely sensation, the power of perception, aesthesis, the power of acting, as it were, knowingly, as we might say, consciously, reacting to events in the external world. Now, at this point, we have creatures that are classified according to the basic functions of nutrition, reproduction, locomotion, and sensation, the last of these qualifying a living entity as animal. These are all powers of the soul. When Aristotle, in his treatise on the soul, offers what he takes to be a precise definition of the soul, the psyche in the Greek, psyche, he says, by psyche I mean the archezoon, the first principle of living things, the principle according to which a thing, if it is alive, comes to have life. He's not treating the soul as a thing capable of existing outside a material entity. Rather, soul is a generic term for processes that are life-giving, life-sustaining, endowing entities with such powers and faculties as movement and sensation. The psychic here refers to a set of processes or powers. Now, with more complex animal forms, to these powers of the soul is added some kind of intellectual or intelligent power, the power of problem solving. Aristotle grants this much to much of the animal kingdom. They have all of that in common with us. Combined with perception, which on Aristotle's account has a very versatile and cognitive dimension to it, the intellectual faculty of more complex animals provides them with formidable psychological resources for learning and memory. Nonetheless, Aristotle reserves to human beings a psychic power or faculty of a very special kind. It is usually rendered in English as reason, but the word he uses in the treatise on the soul, at least the word he employs the first time he refers to this power, is not the Greek nous, or logos, for reason. Rather, it is epistemonikon. Now, let me not be tedious in trying to define some of these ancient words, but by epistemonikon, one would ordinarily be referring to the means or the power, the cognitive ability by which we comprehend universal propositions. That is, a young child exercising the faculties of perception and intelligence might be said to learn many things about a this or a that, but at too young an age, the child could not possibly comprehend a reference to all things or all of that. The child can learn that Uncle Jack and Aunt Mary have died, but it would be very difficult for a 3-year-old to know that, quote, all men are mortal. Now, that capacity to comprehend universal propositions is what epistemonikon is intended to convey. It's a special feature of rationality. It fits us out uniquely for, among other things, the rule of law itself. After all, what is the rule of law except the ability to apply some universal precept to what is an indefinitely large number of individual instances, each qualifying as, for example, theft? It is in virtue of this rationality that we become fit for a mode of political and social life, a mode of civic life, otherwise unavailable to other types within the kingdom of life, types lacking this rational power. Now, given that we have these faculties and powers, how is Aristotle going to understand and approach the problem of knowledge? Well, for Aristotle, to know something is essentially to know the cause of it. Happy is the man who knows the causes of things, is the ancient maxim. To possess this is to possess what in the Greek is called episteme. To have that kind of systematic scientific understanding of things is to know the causes by which things like that are brought about. Aristotle on this subject returns ever so briefly, without ever mentioning the dialogue, to the problem Socrates faces in Meno. The difference between Aristotle's and Plato's approach is fundamental. Aristotle says, in words to this effect, that when we claim that someone knows that a right-angled triangle has 180 degrees, this can be understood in one of two ways. Someone may know that a triangle has 180 degrees because he's actually got some sort of measuring instrument, has measured the angles, and sees that the sum of the angles in a triangle come to 180 degrees. But someone may know that, by definition, a triangle has 180 degrees, and thus knows that this is true of all triangles without measuring any of them. Now, what is the difference between the knowledge of one sort and that of the other? Well, in one case, what is known by experience, such knowledge not rising to the level of episteme. Let's say that it is Mr. Smith who has the measuring device and whose knowledge is limited to what the device reads out when applied to a given triangle. And let's say that Mr. Jones has studied geometry. Jones has a genuine episteme with respect to triangles. Jones really knows what the triangle is, in and of itself and essentially. Smith just happens to know something about a given triangle. So on Aristotle's account, developed knowledge is a knowledge of the regulative principles and laws that govern the affairs of things, and not simply a factual knowledge about this or that. But of course, to say that knowledge requires an understanding of the causes of things is to raise a question about just what a cause is. The Greek word, aiteia, is used indifferently across cases. But as Aristotle is quick to point out in the Metaphysics and in his treatise on physics, cause is not a univocal term. It actually has rather different senses. This is a point that can be easily confused. Let me take as an example some statue or bust or work of sculpture, something that all tourists will know about. Now, everyone traveling to Rome, well, surely all Americans when they go to Rome, generally head first for the Piazza Navona to buy very, very expensive coffee and then treat themselves to Bernini's Fountain of the Rivers. It's a great work of sculpture, and at least you can go home and say you saw Bernini's Fountain of the Rivers. Now, suppose you came from Mars, you landed in the Piazza Navona, right in front of the Fountain of the Rivers, and then were to ask tourists, what's the cause of that? Let's say you pointed to the Fountain of the Rivers and you said, what caused that? You ask some knowing person to account for it. Well, understand that many entirely correct answers can be given to that question. One answer might be this. Look, to have anything like this, you've got to have some kind of material that will retain shape. You can't get something like this if the universe consisted only of air or fluids. So if what you mean by a cause is that which, in the absence of which something else could not be, then surely one of the causes of the Fountain of the Rivers is the material of which it is made. Absent that kind of matter, you couldn't have that kind of thing. Now this answer reaches what Aristotle means by the material cause of something. Of course, the Martian at that point might say, well, look, lots of things can be worked into a shape of some sort. This looks like something special. Well, you might go on to say, not only do you need something that is able to take on a certain shape, but in order for it to be this kind of thing, it has to take on a recognizable shape. It has to have a form that reveals the fact that indeed it is the representation of something. It stands for something. It's something of a certain kind. Thus, you can't have a that unless it formally incorporates some special feature constituted of things like it. Now, such formal features ground what Aristotle meant by the formal cause of something. Now, of course, a pile of bricks is not a house. So what you've got to do to make a house is to start piling up the bricks, putting cement between them, and so forth. And when it comes to the fountain of the rivers, someone or some group had to stand there with hammer and chisel and start working the material into an identifiable shape. Each blow of the hammer on the chisel having some definite effect on the matter, and thus giving shape and form to the block itself. Blow by blow, the material is being changed. And each one of those interactions, each blow, now is part of the efficient cause of what ultimately appears as the fountain of the rivers. It's the billiard ball colliding, hitting another billiard ball, and the second one moving. The impact of the first on the second is the efficient cause of the motion of the second. Now, at that point, if the Martian is an inquisitive chap, he might say, well, how do you know where to hit the material? And at that point, Aristotle would be inclined to say, you don't know where to hit this block of matter unless you already have in mind, as it were, what it is you're trying to bring about. That is, unless you've got Bernini there with this end or goal or aim in mind, this goal, in the Greek, this telos, the fountain of the rivers simply isn't going to take place. Only when the matter is worked according to a plan or goal. Thus, the ultimate understanding of the cause of the object, the ultimate explanation of the fountain of the rivers, is just that intelligent design and aim and objective that was Bernini's. And this is what Aristotle means by the final cause. What he means by final cause is that which is the final thing resulting in time, though it is the first in conception. Do you see? Initially conceived first, the final cause is the end as it is actually brought about. Unless you have the intelligent plan to begin with, none of the rest of these causal modalities will operate to any effect at all. So all of the other causal modalities, choosing the right material, giving it a certain shape, striking blows, all of these are done what? For the sake of something. And what they are done for the sake of is the original plan or design or pattern or goal. A causal explanation that includes these considerations is called, after the Greek telos, a teleological explanation. You explain an object or event by uncovering or identifying the purposes, plans, designs, and goals that the object or event realizes or instantiates when finally brought about. Now, teleological explanations do not have to presuppose some actually intelligent divine being with a plan. Evolutionary theory is teleological in that certain characteristics or phenotypic properties of organisms are what they are because they serve certain purposes integral to the life of the organism. And you understand fins and wings and plumage and mating behavior and the like in terms of survivalistic considerations. These are teleological explanations nonetheless, though they are not what might be called agentically teleological. They don't require the operation of a super entity with a telos in mind, somehow bringing all this about for the sake of this ultimate creature called a swan or a bird. In any case, on Aristotle's account, we do not understand anything fully. We do not have episteme with respect to something unless we're able to comprehend all four causal modalities. To understand what a thing is centrally to know what it's for, to know its purpose. The number of things we can know is based on the number of questions we can ask, he says, of which there are the following. Does a thing exist? If it exists, to what degree does it exist? In what relation does it stand to other things? And what is it for? Now, this is a central point of the Aristotelian program, whether in the domain of knowledge or in the domain of ethics or politics. In the domain of politics, the question would be, what is the polis for? In the domain of ethics, it's going to be, what kind of being am I? And in light of that, how do the actions of mine either realize what is potential within me or stultify what is potential within me? And these potentialities are, in a manner of speaking, what I am here for. And how do I live my life in such a way as to honor the central fact of my being? Now, the developed knowledge that we have leads us to an understanding that the things of the universe, including living things of the universe, do instantiate a design feature, a plan. They fit in. Nature does not do things without a purpose. So when you find a reliably occurring phenomenon, the ultimate question you're asking at the epistemic level, after you've satisfied yourself that it's made of stone, it's made of marble, it's wood, the ultimate question is, how does this fit into things? What is it for? What purpose does it serve? What is its function? The explanations ought to be functionalist explanations, but functionalist in a rather enlarged sense. You do know at the outset that nothing with pattern and design is going to come about accidentally. As Aristotle says in his treatise on physics, if the art of shipbuilding were in the wood, we would have ships by nature. Now let me repeat that. It's a statement made in the physics, and in fact it really grounds Aristotle's notion of final causes very aptly. If the art of shipbuilding were in the wood, there would just be something about wood such that if you left it around long enough, a great ancient Greek trireme would develop. Sails there and oarsmen, do you see? Leather sails, all of that. No, says Aristotle, you do not get ships that way. Leave wood out for a very long time and you get rotten wood. The art of shipbuilding is not in something intrinsic to wood. You may need wood to make ships, but wood just enters in as the material cause of a ship. You need all sorts of workmen to know where to put the dowels and the sails and the rudder. But they serve here as modes of efficient causation, as instruments serving some purpose of which they might be entirely ignorant. The art of shipbuilding is finally in the ship's designer. It is the designer who knows what ships are for and how that purpose is served by the right material rightly assembled. To know in this sense is to comprehend far more than anything conveyed by the mere material composition of an object. This is an almost offhand reply to Democritus and the atomistic theory of reality. It's not enough to say that the ultimate constituents of reality are atomic particles. That provides no more than an account of the materiality of the universe. But that surely is a very pared-down form of knowledge, and certainly nothing rising to the level of episteme. Truly developed knowledge embraces not only the material, efficient, and formal causes, but that for the sake of which these causes were recruited in the first instance, that for the sake of which. Now there is something else in Aristotle's philosophy of explanation, his philosophy of science, worth noting, because I think Aristotle on this count is sometimes misunderstood. Aristotle does argue that a thoroughly scientific explanation is one that includes a universal principle of which the thing to be explained is an instance. What he's getting at is the notion that we do not fully understand an event unless in fact we can articulate the general law that it is an example of. But when Aristotle is writing on biological subjects as opposed to purely physical ones, when he's writing on biological and particularly on psychological and social matters, he inserts a qualifier, almost like a place mark. The expression in the Greek is hosepito pouli, which is best rendered as for the most part, by and large, or in general. So one should not go away with the view that Aristotle's model of explanation requires of an explanation that it's always expressed to the nth place after the decimal, covered by an swerving, deterministic physical law. Obviously, if there is variability in the phenomenon itself, the best explanation will not hide from it. Aristotle teaches us to expect precision only to the extent that a subject allows it, and to seek no more precision than what the subject at hand will admit of. We do not ask for probable reasoning from a mathematician, nor do we ask for certainty from a shoe cobbler. So when it comes to these phenomena, those complex social, political, and moral events, understandings, dispositions, characteristics overwhelmed by the complexities of life, by the ambiguities inherent in the case, what we look for are general precepts, which are right by and large, in general, and for the most part. Hosepi to poli. Read in a certain light, this is a rather liberating conception in relation to the teachings of the Academy.